Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the arrival of our chief guest, gracing this occasion. His Excellency the President, Ranil Wickremesinghe, being accompanied by the Honorable Minister, Nimal Sidipala de Silva. Please be seated, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the inauguration of the workshop where we are ready to discuss the 30-year development plan of the North Port of Colombo, which is being held under the auspices of His Excellency the President, Ranil Wickremesinghe, who is gracing this occasion at the invitation of our guest of honor, Honorable Minister Nimal Sidipala de Silva, and at the same time, Honorable State Minister of Ports and Aviation, Honorable Premalal Jayasekara, and at the same time, the Chairman of the Sri Lanka Ports Authority, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Keith Bernard, and the Managing Director, Mr. Susantha Besirivardhana. The intent of the proposed CNP development is to provide additional port capacity within a sheltered harbour for future freight traffic, and the primary aim is to accommodate forecast growth in the gateway cargo and transshipment containers up to the year 2050. We are ready to discuss further details with regards to all these in the next couple of hours. Ladies and gentlemen, now would like to call upon the Honourable Minister, Nimal Sidipala de Silva, to welcome all of you for this lovely gathering. Please welcome Honourable Minister Nimal Sidipala de Silva.
His Excellency, the President, Ranil Wickremesinghe, Mr. Sagala Ratnayaka, the President's Chief of Staff, Mr. Ruan Chandra, my Secretary of my Ministry, Mr. Keith Bernard, Chairman of SLPA, all the other officials of my Ministry and SLPA, and distinguished representatives from the maritime sector of Sri Lanka, other invitees, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure. It is my honor and privilege to welcome His Excellency President Ranil Wickremesinghe for gracing this occasion despite his busy schedule. I also welcome all other dignitaries and the representatives of the maritime sector and members of the international organizations who have gathered here today to witness this presentation. You are aware the port of Colombo was traditionally a traditional port earlier, but it commenced transforming itself to from a traditional port to a transshipment hub in the Indian Ocean in 1980s. Thereafter, we have moved forward, and now we are handling 7 million TEUs a year. So our intention and our vision is that with the present development going on in the port, to increase it to 1.5 million TEUs a year. For that purpose, we have embarked upon a lot of activities in the port. We have embraced ourselves with the private sector and foreign investors, and I'm happy to state that Adani Group with Sri Lankan entrepreneurs John Keels, we are developing the West Terminal. The work has started, so we are very happy the work is going on well. As far as the terminals which are governed, managed by the Port Authority is concerned, Jaya Terminal and the Eastern Terminal, both we have siphoned a lot of money for their development. For Jaya Terminal alone, we have allocated 7,000 million for its development. So the development work is going on. Then of course, for the ECT, also colossal sum of money has been allocated to develop that, and the development program is going on according to the schedule. Then of course, we have other developments in the area. With the assistance of the Asian Development Bank, we have the elevated highway, which will give a glory as well as more connectivity to the port of Colombo. Then with the assistance of the Asian Development Bank, we are putting up our administrative building, 18-story building, for all the components of the Port Authority will be in one place. Then other warehouses, etc. Your Excellency, 2 hours ago, we signed, SLPA signed an agreement, investment agreement with China merchants and Sri Lankan entrepreneur to establish Art of Center, logistic center in the port of Colombo at the cost of 400 million US dollars. I am happy to say that your government was able to attract this investment. This has been hanging over for last 5 years. The concept of North Port development was germinated in the mind of His Excellency Mahinda Ranil Wickremesinghe at that time. You foresaw that at certain point our port will become saturated. So how to cater for the demand that will be created in the world and in the maritime industry. So therefore, always when I took my office as the Minister of Ports and Aviation, you were talking about the North Port development. So I had the pleasure of conducting several progressive meetings, etc., and then talk to the stakeholders and the Asian Development Bank, who graciously supported us to embark upon the feasibility study of the North Port development. So the idea of the North Port development is that we can't shift to the south. You have to go to the north and develop the port. But Your Excellency, my persistent view is that the North Port development, this port must be a privately managed port. This is the experience I have got within this 1 or 2 years of my ministry here. So I think that is your vision too. But of course, the Port Authority should be a regulator and an investor. I am happy to note that I was briefed by the consultants appointed by the ADB that this project is financially viable, technically feasible. So I was very happy. So that we are embarking upon a project which would be financially viable and technically feasible. So therefore, in order to cater to the need of the nation and your vision to make Sri Lanka a giant in the maritime industry, as well as to rebuild the Sri Lankan economy, certainly the North Port development will help us a lot. So therefore, I am happy as your cabinet colleague of the cabinet in your cabinet to support your vision and make it a reality. So I am sure we have shipping magnates here in Sri Lanka. So they are doing very well. So I would invite them to take part in these future developments. And as well as the foreign investors who are interested, they should come along with us and support us in this venture. So with that note, Your Excellency, I thank everybody for participating in this symposium, and especially I would like to thank the Asian Development Bank and the team of our officers of the SLPA who did tireless work for preparing this feasibility study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Honourable Minister of Ports, Shipping and Aviation, Honourable Nimon Siripala de Silva, welcoming all of you whilst making the opening remarks. And as he clearly mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, Sri Lanka Ports Authority has initiated a plethora of development drives, especially the East Container Terminal 2, the West Container Terminal 1, WCT2, etc., in line with the National Port Master Plan. And now it's time to take a look at a very special video compiled on all these series of development activities undertaken by the Sri Lanka Ports Authority.
Discover the latest development highlights of the ports in Sri Lanka, a prime strategic location in the Indian Ocean that lies a mere 7 nautical miles from the renowned maritime Silk Route. The Sri Lankan port sector, renowned among mariners throughout history, has been transformed into a commercial port in recent times. Following the country's independence in 1948 and the establishment of the Sri Lanka Ports Authority in 1979, the port of Colombo has been developed competitively with other global ports. Sri Lanka boasts 2 megaports and 3 regional ports, making it the ultimate maritime gateway to South Asia. The Port of Colombo, a world-class container port, ranks 23rd globally and stands tall among the top 10 best connectivity ports in the world. But Sri Lanka is not resting on its laurels. With the ambition to establish itself as the Asian maritime hub, Sri Lanka has launched a plethora of development projects across its ports, setting the stage for a transformational journey towards global excellence. Join us in exploring the exciting prospects and the upcoming game-changing projects that are set to take the ports of Sri Lanka to new heights of success and prosperity. The Sri Lanka Ports Authority has emerged victorious once again, achieving unparalleled success at the prestigious Global Port Forum Awards held in Dubai 2023. Crowned as the Ports Authority of the Year, as well as the recipient of the highly coveted Best State-Run Terminal of the Year award, the SLPA has once again raised the bar for excellence in the maritime industry. The Ministry of Ports, Shipping and Aviation provides direction for the growth of Sri Lanka's commercial port sector, which is being modernized to meet global trends and overcome challenges in the shipping industry. However, compared to other regions' significant development strategies in the global trade shipping industry, Sri Lanka's port industry needs to progress further. His Excellency the President Ranil Wickremesinghe has conceived the idea of establishing a new port north of the existing port of Colombo with maximum capacity. A long-term project aimed at boosting Sri Lanka's socio-economic development. Today marks the first step towards realizing this massive and ambitious project.
A series of development activities carried out by the Sri Lanka Ports Authority, which would pave the way for our island nation, Sri Lanka, to be the maritime hub of the Asian region. Ladies and gentlemen, with that note, it's time to take a look at another video compiled on the development activities which will be carried out for the development of the Colombo North Port. Ladies and gentlemen, the AECOM Infrastructure and Environment UK Limited has been appointed by Sri Lanka Ports Authority to undertake a feasibility study with regards to the Colombo North Port Development Plan. And now would like to call upon three representatives gracing this occasion to take us through the development activity at the Colombo North Port. First, I would like to call upon Mr. Lee Butashi, the project director, who's also the team leader, who's a chartered engineer with over 30 years of experience of leading, managing, and delivering a variety of civil engineering work, including maritime structures, highway and railway structures, maritime and infrastructure-related projects. He's the director responsible for the AECOM sports and marine sector within the Europe and Indian region, Mr. Lee Butashi. Then we also have Mr. Martin Manion, who's the port planning and maritime expert, who has 30 years of professional experience in planning, design, and supervision of maritime projects globally. He provides expert advisory and technical and commercial management of innovative solutions for port and maritime developments, including the master planning, port optimization, feasibility, and design of port facilities. Mr. Chris Johnson, the environmental expert, who is the principal environmental consultant within AECOM's International Environment Team, and he has been involved in delivering of numerous high-profile environmental and social impact assessments for both offshore and onshore, nearshore developments worldwide, including renewables, water, ports, aviation, railway, tourism, nuclear, urban regeneration, and oil and gas. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the representatives of AECOMS.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, honored ministers, Mr. Chairman, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lee Batarchi, and my colleagues and I are delighted to have been invited here today to talk to you about the Colombo Northport feasibility study. We were appointed back in February 2020 by Asian Development Bank and Sri Lanka Ports Authority to undertake the study. And whilst the COVID pandemic did its best to slow us down, we pushed through and have completed the study, which we're going to talk to you about today. So as part of our presentation, we're going to look through an overview of the study deliverables and methodology that we employed, the field investigations and planning. We're going to look through some of the shortlisted development options that we looked at, and the modelling and simulations that were done for those options, and then the analysis that we went through to come to the preferred option. And then, having arrived at that preferred option, we're going to look through the development stages and the timeline that it'll take to implement those, and how the private sector participation and financial assessment was undertaken to ensure that it was a viable option. And then we're going to look through some of the environmental and social impact assessments aspects that we looked at for that preferred option, and then give you some conclusions and recommendations. So my colleagues, Martin Mannion and Chris Johnson, are going to talk to you through some of the detail of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Ioban. I'm going to lead you through starting with the process that was undertaken. So this is a simplistic summary. So what we start with is two things in parallel: undertaking surveys and field work, geotechnical work, engineering, what is technically feasible, and combining that information to come up with the alternative development options that are potentially there for this development of the North Port. We step forward with the economic and financial evaluation in order to develop the recommended option that you'll see later on today. We'll finalize, we'll provide more detail in the next 15-20 minutes. So on the right-hand side, you could see some of the process that we went through in terms of reporting. There was a lot of consultation steps along the way to ensure that the right information has been taken on board as we step through. This is a little bit more detailed. So there was a lot of emphasis on the technical side, as I mentioned, very much supported by, for example, modeling of waves, sediment, tides, river, etc., so that we could look at those alternatives in great detail, work out which one worked best in terms of matching the demand requirements at Colombo over time, and then identifying how that should be phased as well in order to come up with the recommended option you'll see in a second. So just initially, in terms of the type of field investigations, a lot of data did exist, but we want as you know, the best data that we can. So we, for example, undertook another 30 marine boreholes in the area of the particular northern port development, collected more tidal and metocean information as well, so that we could understand those effects fully, both operationally and from an extreme point of view. At the same time, we looked at the Kalani River, collected more information on it so that we could understand how that integrated with the project. Meanwhile, in parallel, we were looking at environmental aspects. So that, for example, was air quality, noise monitoring, understanding what the marine ecology was in the area and nearby, and what may or may not be affected by such a development. And that all feeds into the option development. But just stepping back, the crucial aspect is understanding what is the demand up to 2050. So this study, whilst it looks at trade generally and did forecast generally on trade for the whole port, the focus of Northport is for containers, but look to support bulk trade where possible. So for example, what you can see is there may be 7 million TEU today. In the base case forecast, that steps up to 19 million TEU by 2050. In the high case forecast, it's 29 million TEU for the Port of Colombo in the future. So quite a significant step forward. Now, some of that will be coming from Southport maximization over time, but there is a gap to be filled by Northport to reach the objectives in 2050. So one aspect as well is there had been a previous National Ports Master Plan with a forecast, and the forecast has actually improved for Colombo over time because, of course, competitor port circumstances change. So in this case, an Indian port development didn't take place, and that creates a better position for Colombo. So this really is a bit of a representation of what does that demand mean for the North Port development. So what we did is, in green, what you see is when the North Port would become operational, and that is shown in the high case as year 2034. But to be ready in 2034 to operate, you've got to start building your breakwaters in 2029. If you're going to be having a contractor on site in 2029, you need to spend a few years on planning and detailed design before that to get the fine details sorted out. And what you can see along the way is a number of other steps, like relocation of Mutwal outfall, some pipeline readjustments as well. So a number of steps have to take place to enable Northport to take shape. And what you see then is that Colombo Northport fills that gap, the new development, to meet the needs by 2050. So looking at the sort of options we came up with, these are some of the shortlisted options, just for illustration purposes. Before then, of course, we had a much longer list that we discussed in depth. We looked at what the constraints were, planning, access, environmentally, etc. What area could a development take place in within the North Harbour in general? And then we focused in on this particular area. So the shortlist was narrowed down to 2 alternatives. Those were worked further and became the preferred option, which was refined through some other steps and further detailed modeling, for example. So looking at the sort of steps that we used, we had a lot of coastal modeling software and river modeling, looking at what were the effects of the different options so that we could work out which ones worked best, basically. So that is looking at the influence of waves, tides, sediment movement, river changes over time. At the same time, it's very important to make sure that marine access is correct. So this is an illustration that we did a lot of modeling to make sure that the largest ships in the future can access these new container terminals. So for example, one refinement we made was we had to increase the northernmost new basin from 550 meters wide to 700 to make sure that that was a safe navigation, for example. And we assessed the channel as well to make sure that it was technically feasible. So along the way, what we did then was we looked at how do you assess all these options. We came up with criteria, and then per criteria you have a score. You weight each one, and we worked out which were the important ones in consultation, and we applied scoring to various shortlisted options in order to work out what is best. So you can see this evolving towards option D5A and D6, which ultimately became merged in certain aspects when we refined it further. And then it becomes the shortlisted option you see here. So what is this preferred option? It is based on the build-out of and maximization of the Southport first, and that means completing West Container Terminal 1 and 2, ECT, as you see it at present, but being extended from 1,300 meters to 1,800 meters. SAGT similarly would reach 2,200 meters of quay length, for example, in that maximization in the south. The new development in the north then provides 3 new container terminals. Each has 3 berths, and they are 1,400 meters in each of the first 2 phases, and then 1,800 in the last. So 4.6 kilometers of quay. The new terminal also provides 700 meters for multi-purpose activities, 2 new liquid berths, and crucially it provides a lot of logistics and warehouse space as well to support the port functionality. There are a number of breakwaters required, so the longest is at 7 kilometers for that new sheltered area. And what this achieves is a container terminal capacity of 11 million, which allows the port overall to reach 29 million in the future. We then show a number of phases for the development, and this is just really showing you where things stand now when East Container Terminal and West Container Terminal reach completion of the current developments. So that is as will soon be. Then at that point, the South Harbour Western Breakwater would be extended as originally planned, but slightly further, creating a triangle of land of 40 hectares with a potential LNG berth adjacent to it. In green on the left, you see a potential additional reclamation for 200 hectares or so of logistics space as well. And then on the right-hand side in red, you can see the relocation of the Mutwal outfall. So that is going to be done before any of the Northport development itself takes place in order to allow that to happen. So it goes out into much deeper water with better dispersion characteristics. And there is some relocation of CPC oil pipelines as well to be done before Northport real development starts. And then in this next slide, you will see the start of the serious works for the Northport development. You see the very large new breakwater, which provides the sheltered water. It allows the expansion of ECT and SAGT to the maximum extent. There in orange, you can see dredged areas being used for reclamation, early stage reclamation. We try and use dredging wherever possible. You see a river training wall, 950 meters long for the Killarney River to divert the flow away from the new development as well. And we commenced the route connection to shore, so all the support facilities need to go into that area. Then we step on again. There's more dredging. Again, it goes into reclamation for the very first container terminal. 3 berths, 1,400 meters of quay with potential rail access as well. And we begin to reclaim the logistics areas at the back as well. The next stage is dredging and reclamation and quay wall formation for the second container terminal of the Northport development, another 1,400 meters of quay. And then in the final phase, the third container terminal would be added with the potential for a rail connection at the back. So just to pick out a few features around on the top left, you can see a potential oil tank storage area or logistics area, the 40 hectares that I mentioned on the western breakwater. You can see that the container terminals are supported by logistics areas or general multi-purpose terminal areas, not just simply the immediate container terminal concession areas. And there's a considerable road and rail access arrangements at the route with the utilities required to support this new development. So what does the development timeline look like? Obviously, ECT and West Container Terminal Phase 1 are underway at present. The completion of the Western Container Terminal and Eastern Container Terminal SAGT maximization would take place before the first Northport terminals became available. So like I mentioned earlier, in the high case demand for the Northport, Phase 1 would need to be ready in 2034, and it would be followed subsequently by the future phases. Now, of course, SLPA will be monitoring trade demand over time and can make fine adjustments to the timing as things proceed. So we looked at what was the best way to implement these projects in terms of private sector participation. We looked at a number of different models for that. And the one we're recommending is that the Port Authority would act as the landlord. They would fund the common infrastructure. What do we mean by that? That means the breakwater, dredging, partial reclamation, access road gates, and all the enabling works like the pipefall and outfall realignments in advance and adequate utility supply, of course. Meanwhile, the terminal operators under concession would fund their own terminal development, so the quay, the paving, their own equipment to suit their method of operation, building in utilities within that terminal footprint under a design, build, finance, operate arrangement. At the same time, we looked at various recommendations for Port Authority organisation and institutional reforms in order to support potential private sector involvement. From there, we stepped on to looking at the financial and economic evaluations. So just in pure financial terms, you're looking at what is the capital and operating costs and the revenue and what are the financial returns on the project. We did separately also look at the economic returns indirectly to the nation as well. And what does that show? That shows that for the common infrastructure by the Port Authority and the first two container terminals are viable for the high demand case based on the current traffic forecasts. If demand goes along the lines of the base case, then the common infrastructure and the first container terminal will be viable. So it can be seen that the container terminal development is viable. If you did a direct comparison with the Southport, it's not quite as attractive, but that's because there's a greater logistics area, for example, and other aspects which haven't directly been taken in terms of all the benefits in this analysis. So this next slide provides some of the summary information on it. So what sort of investment are we talking about? So for the Port Authority, it's in the region of $925 million for the common infrastructure. The first container terminal and second container terminal are in the region of 950 million each. If you looked at the overall costs of all the potential development for the North Port, the whole scheme would be an investment in the region of $4.5 billion over time. So that's a bit of an overview of it. In terms of the indirect benefits, the economic benefits, those are a multiple of 2 to 3 times as well of the benefits taken into account in the pure financial analysis. So what we found is that it is viable, basically. At this point, I'll hand over to Chris, who'll take you through 2 slides on the environmental side, and then we'll step to conclusions and recommendations.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So to quickly take you through the environmental and social impact assessment, we were working to the terms of reference provided by the Coastal Department in line with Sri Lankan laws and regulations. We were also guided by the IFC Environmental and Social Performance Standards, as well as the World Bank Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines, and also the Asian Development Bank ADB safeguard documents. So below on the screen, you can see a process here. This is a basic outline of the process followed in environmental impact assessment. So you can see first off, we would commence with baseline data gathering, whether that's for the physical, chemical, social, or biological environment. We then move on to a stage of stakeholder engagement, where we engage with a variety of different line agencies, stakeholders, local communities and businesses, and those people who might be affected by the project. After that, we can move on to the impact identification and assessment stage, where we try to predict the different environmental and social impacts that might result from the development of the project, both during its construction and its operation. We then, once we understand the impacts, we're then able to move on to identifying mitigation measures. So that's looking at ways where we can either avoid, minimize, reduce, or offset the environmental and social impacts that might result from the project. And finally, we look to develop an outline environmental and social management plan and grievance redress mechanism. So the outline ESMP effectively takes all of the mitigation that's been identified as part of the environmental and social impact assessment and puts that into a document that can be used by SLPA and future contractors in order to manage their environmental and social risk as the project progresses. So on this next slide, I'll just very quickly take you through some of the conclusions and recommendations from the environmental and social impact assessment. So whilst the project is likely to result in some adverse impacts, most of which are relating to the marine environment, as you might expect with a port project, some of these that remain are largely unavoidable, and that is because the project or a project like Colombo Northport, purely because of its nature and scale, it can be impossible to avoid all impacts that occur. But it's very important that the consenting authorities, ladies and gentlemen in the room, weigh some of these adverse impacts against the wider economic benefits that are likely to result from a development such as Colombo Northport. Furthermore, it's recommended that the EIA report's mitigation, the measures that are included in the report and the outline environmental social management plan should be made available as part of tender documents to any construction contractors so that they're aware of the environmental and social mitigation commitments, management and monitoring that they'll have to take place when building the development. Finally, it's important to note that responsibility for implementation of environmental and social impact mitigation and monitoring measures will be borne by SLPA. However, the actual implementation of many of these measures will be largely carried out by SLPA's appointed contractors, but of course always under the supervision of SLPA, project lenders, as well as existing regulatory mechanisms and laws. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. The good news, ladies and gentlemen, is we didn't bring along our 90-slide set. You've only got 4 more slides to go. Recommendations, we recommend to proceed with Colombo Northport after the completion of the maximisation of the Southport development, in other words, West Container Terminal East and SAGT maximisation. And we have a preferred option. It is a hybrid out of the original D5 and D6 options. That'll become historic terminology, of course. We do recommend that it proceeds on the basis of SLPA acting as that landlord, funding the common infrastructure as described earlier, with the concession to each container terminal operator who would fund the terminal infrastructure as described earlier. There will be adjacent logistics areas identified for private development as well. So you can see that we undertook quite an extensive amount of fieldwork already in order to develop this to a feasibility level. Through the detailed design stage, there's definitely a need to supplement that further, because once you hone in on the recommended solution, you find out where some further information will be very useful, and that will be on Clanny River flows, some more geotechnical information, traffic as well, in order to optimize and finalize the detailed design in the next stage of the project. There is a logistics and warehouse study which has been carried out to support that side of the development as well. Archaeology and heritage assessment has been supplemented recently by the department, and there will be further looks at the vessel traffic implications. So various recommendations have been made to make sure that the next stage is carried out in the right manner. And just on the bottom point there, we've recommended the organizational amendments and institutional reforms. So what does that mean? That is fundamentally around SLPA acting as a landlord and regulator function, and potentially moving to wholly owned subsidiaries for the operating terminals and separately for logistics operations in the future. So thank you, S2T, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, ACOM. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for all your concerns, clarifications that you need with regards to the details that we discuss here. And to take us through this Q&A forum, would like to call upon the Managing Director of Sri Lanka Ports Authority, Mr. Susantha Besirivardhana. So if you have any questions, concerns, please raise your hand so that we have the mics available. We can provide you with a mic to ask all the questions. It's an audience full of all the stalwarts in the field of maritime and freight. Seems everything was cut and clear. So if there are no questions, of course, during the fellowship time, you can talk to all the respective officials with regards to the details that we discuss here. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we'd like to call upon our chief guest, gracing this occasion, His Excellency the President. Please welcome Mr. Ranil Wickramasinghe to address all of you.
Honorable Minister, the Secretary of the Ministry, Chairman of the Ports Authority, distinguished guests, and friends. I must first commend the Minister and the SLPA for the work they have done. This ministry is now called the Ministry of Shipping and Aviation. Some people have asked me, why don't we split and have two ministries, one for shipping and one for aviation? And I said, no. Our intention is to make Sri Lanka an air-sea hub. So we will have one Ministry of Shipping and Aviation. So we've got to think differently. And I think the Minister is the best person to be in charge. Sri Lanka has to think of the future. What we will do in the next 25 years. How are we going ahead to make this a developed country? We have to look at the developments in India, in Bangladesh, in Iran, the total Makaran coast, in assessing the role that Sri Lanka has to play as a hub. That is important. So in addition to Colombo, we have the Galle port, which is potential for tourism, the Hambantota port, and the Trincomalee port. The Trincomalee port we are discussing with India on the development of the Trincomalee port on the basis that in the next 25 years, there will be vast developments on the Bay of Bengal, both on the Indian side, the Bangladeshi side, Malaysia, and even Myanmar. So we have to look at the Trincomalee port, also its capacity to be a point for cruise tourism in the Bay of Bengal. On Colombo port, Hambantota, at the moment, we have the port functioning, not at its full capacity, but the developments in Hambantota in the next 10-15 years, where about 4,000 acres will be set aside just for India manufacturing, not taking into account the development of agriculture and fisheries, will mean, and the fact that there's going to be at least one refinery means that the activities there will increase. We have the airports which we are developing, Katunayaka Airport which has to be further developed, Mattal Airport which has to be commercially viable. Then with those two airports, we've just opened up Palali and development of Hinguragoda as the main domestic airport for the eastern region and the north central province. So within this, it's a role that the North Port has to play. We have to think now of what the development should be. The SLPA and the consultants have given us a report on the feasibility of the North Port. We have to remember one thing only, that what is going to take place in India, what's the development in Pakistan, and what's the development going to be in Iran. Those three will decide the capacity. The number of TUs that we can have, the number of containers, the units we have would depend on that. As it is now, people have a very bright forecast for India. And that's possible, it can be achieved. By 2050, India will be the most populous country in the world. From 1.4 billion, it will be up to 1.7 billion people. The industrialization of India is going fast, especially in some areas. You find Gujarat, Maharashtra, and other one is the southern India, especially in Tamil Nadu. But this is the beginning. From there, it should spread to other areas. So industrialization, manufacturing is now taking place in India. It still hasn't reached the level that China reached somewhere in 2010. It still has to go there. So if at all at some stage, it will be that the progress will be not arithmetic, but geometrical progression. So we will have the development in India. Then what is the connectivity that's going to take place between India and Sri Lanka? Our closest point is in the north. Are we going to have a roll-on, roll-off ferries? Are we going to have a more permanent structures? These are issues that we have to resolve. And that will also determine the viability of our ports, especially of the port of Colombo. So in looking at the port, there's only two issues which I thought came to my mind. Firstly is the environment, especially the impact on fishing. That we have to take seriously, because before you start building, you have to get the support of the people in the area. Secondly is, we are also discussing India, but if at the end of it, the projections show that the development will be fast and there will be a need for more, certainly a larger capacity for containers, then we may have to make adjustments. That we will know. We'll be going into India and having talks with them. So we will have an idea of what is the low growth scenario and what is the high growth scenario, and where will it take place. Because India also has to develop its port. But Sri Lanka's advantage is the port we have. Secondly is Pakistan. Though it may be going through a financial crisis now like us, in time to come, when you look at the population, it has a great capacity for development, followed by Iran. And if Iran goes ahead with the Chaba port, which will join up to Central Asia and Russia, then Makaran coast itself is something to look at. So these are all areas we have to think of development. In the meantime, remember that the Chinese are undertaking east to west railways in Africa, together with the African nations. One which will go from Kenya all the way to West African coast, and another which will most probably go through Congo. So the whole logistics and transport in the region will change. And we have to take that into account and make whatever adjustments we do now to ensure that Sri Lanka it becomes the hub of the Indian Ocean. We can do it. We should do it. We did that over 1,000 years ago. I am sure we make up our mind, we go ahead. So I must thank the Minister for all the effort that he has taken in, and we can also start discussing what the future steps should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, the President, Ranil Wickramasinghe. So with that note, ladies and gentlemen, we wrap up the formalities on behalf of the Honorable Minister, Nima Siripal De Silva, State Minister, Honorable Premalal Jayasekara, the Chairman, Mr. Keith Bernard, and the Managing Director, Mrs. Santa Abesirwadana, would like to express our extreme gratitude for all of you gracing this occasion. And ladies and gentlemen, in wrapping up, would like to invite all of you to enjoy the refreshments being served in the foyer area. Thank you very much, everyone. Have yourselves a pleasant stay.